Even during David's reign, there are signs that there are tensions between Judah and the other tribes. In fact, we might even go back to Genesis to see these tensions and the way that Judah left his brothers in the aftermath of selling Joseph into slavery. And certainly during David's reign, there are at least two occasions when the northern tribes joined sides with David's enemies. Although on both occasions, David successfully not only manages to win the battle, but win the northern tribes back. What we observed during Solomon's reign is how this became worse, and a sensation of all the building projects and the taxation and the forced labor, that Judah was gaining all the benefits of Solomon's reign, while the rest of the tribes were paying the price. And we saw at the end of the last course how at the end of Solomon's reign, when he's led astray, he's been led by his wives to worship other gods, a declaration comes as a prophetic declaration from Ahijah that says that after Solomon's death, Jeroboam, who at that time was one of his officers and escaped to Pharaoh, he will become king over the northern tribes.
'Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam son of Nebat heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. They replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, "What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, 'Lighten the yoke your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him replied, "These people have said to you, 'Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter.' Now tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions."
So as we have seen, very early in his reign, Rehoboam has received what seems to us, a very reasonable request from the northern tribes, simply that if he reduces the burden of taxation and forced labor, they will serve him. And as the text shows, he is faced with two competing sets of advice. The old advisors who had seen what had been happening under Solomon's reign suggest that he win them over, perhaps take a leaf out of David's book to win the people over, and then they will serve him gladly. But his friends, his young advisors, they tell him, no, go start off as you mean to continue. Show a heavy hand, terrorize the northern tribes, and they will submit to you.
3 days later Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king answered the people harshly. Rejecting the advice given him by the elders, he followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier." My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam son of Nebat through Ahijah the Shilonite. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. When all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David.
Rehoboam, rather foolishly, decides to listen to his younger advisors, and so the response of the other tribes is to turn their back on David and David's monarchy. They say, what share do we have in David? Rehoboam shows his inept nature even further by sending Adoniram, the person in charge of forced labor, which was one of the sources of complaints, to try and insist that the Israelites turn from their decision, and he is stoned to death. Rehoboam's next step is actually to muster an army to go to war against the northern tribes and bring them back by force. And he was actually instructed by God not to do so, and actually obeys. One of the interesting features of the story is that though God has promised to Solomon that one tribe will remain loyal to David, in fact, when the kingdoms are divided, Benjamin is incorporated into the southern kingdom. And this might be surprising because Benjamin is actually Saul's tribe. There are probably two reasons for it. One is Benjamin was a very small tribe, very few men, and therefore unable to sort of stand up to Judah. And Judah geographically separated Benjamin from the rest of the tribes. In a sense, Benjamin by this point becomes assimilated into Judah. The tribe of Levi, because of the presence of the temple in Jerusalem, also predominantly is on Rehoboam's side out of its association with the temple. And this is important for the progression of the story.
Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord, Rehoboam king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings.
In the ancient world, religious and national and political identity were very closely related, and Jeroboam then faces a dilemma that if he allows the people to continue to go up to Jerusalem to worship and offer sacrifices, that they will retain a loyalty to David's line. So his solution on advice is to set up two altars, two sanctuaries, one in the south in Bethel and one in the north in Dan. And we are told that he places a golden calf in each of these sanctuaries. And it's uncertain to what extent, because in the Hebrew, Elohim can both be used to refer to one God or more than one God, whether Jeroboam is saying that he's replacing the Lord, and therefore he's going against the first commandment, and he was replacing the worship of the true God with these golden calves, or whether he is breaking the second commandment, and these are idols which are meant to represent the Lord. We're also told that he allowed high places to proliferate. These would be local sanctuaries, and also because of the tribe of Levi was associated with the Jerusalem temple and the Ark of the Covenant and David's line, he started to promote priests who were not from the tribe of Levi. Time of the part of the story that we are covering is told in the Bible, both in the books of the Kings and Chronicles. However, Chronicles tends to focus on the kingdom of Judah and on matters to do with the temple. So we'll be using mainly the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, if you've ever read through it and found it rather tricky, that is quite understandable, and they're very different reasons why it could be tricky. One is that it's actually a hard story to tell. The action needs to swing between the kings of Judah and Israel, and sometimes it sort of moves backwards and forwards in time. So it's easy to get a bit disoriented. Of course, in fact, like even today, people have names which are similar, and many of the kings of Israel and Judah have identical or very similar names, so it's quite easy to be confused. Also, there are no external time markers. Dates tend to be linked to the reign of kings. So often, when we're told that a king of Judah comes to power, that is in the year, whatever year it was, of the king of Israel, and vice versa. And again, it can be easy to lose track of the timing in this sense. Also, a significant portion of the books is dedicated to the ministries of Elijah and Elisha, a whole chunk in the middle, and we'll be dealing with them in one session just for both of them. But what you find is sometimes it can even be tricky to lose track of, well, which king, which episode in a history is this text relating to. Also, the word Israel starts to acquire different meanings here, because when it talks about a people, the people of Israel generally encompasses all of Jacob's descendants, all the tribes. But if it's used as a kingdom, as a political entity, it's referring only to the northern kingdom. And also another source of confusion is that one of the local kingdoms, which is often the enemy, Syria, although they're sometimes called the Arameans, well, Syria sounds very similar to the great empire Assyria. So these are some of the reasons why it can be challenging to read these books. As we move forward reading and going through 1st and 2nd Kings, there are some useful things to remember which help us. One is to realize that the northern kingdom was on the whole wealthier and more powerful than the southern kingdom. Israel benefited from having important trade routes going through it, so commerce prospered there more than it did in the southern kingdom, Judah. And so in the story, generally speaking, in terms of military might, Israel was more able to interfere with Judah, and there may have been stages in the story where actually Judah was subordinate to Israel as a vassal state. However, Judah benefited from greater political stability. The legitimacy of David's monarchy was not internally questioned. They also benefited from having a capital city which they were able to defend even when all else was lost, whilst Israel struggled with a succession of military coups and purging of the leadership. An important factor to remember is that from the time of Solomon through to Elisha, the great empires were generally quiet. Every now and then we read of a military excursion by the Egyptians, but on the whole, the main threats that Israel and Judah faced were from each other and their surrounding neighbors, especially the Syrians. And so when the prophets thought of God's punishment in those days, it was mainly in terms of temporal setbacks and military defeat, poor harvests, droughts. However, in the second half of the book of Second Kings, the great empires of Assyria and then Babylon become more active. And therefore, when God's punishment is proclaimed by the prophets, it is often viewed in terms of destruction and exile at the hand of these empires. Most of the kings, we are given a verdict about whether they did good or evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, the author of Kings, he bases his judgment on the principles established in the book of Deuteronomy. And generally speaking, the kings are judged through three criteria. Firstly, did they worship the Lord exclusively? Were they devoted to only worshipping God? Did they also promote idol worship? Particularly important was, did they promote social justice? How good were their reigns in caring for the poor and the vulnerable, the orphans and the widows? And were they scrupulous in observing the law, in insisting that sacrifices were offered at the central sanctuary by the authorized priesthood from the tribe of Levi? And these three criteria determine whether a king did right or evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, we saw how one of the first things that Jeroboam did was to create these two idols, two sanctuaries in Bethel and in Dan. The best case scenario was that he was promoting the worship of God in the form of an idol, and the worst case scenario is he was replacing the Lord with other gods. But because all the kings of Israel carried on with this practice, by definition, by the criteria of our author, they all did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So that's a verdict for every king of the northern kingdom. Now, in the southern kingdom, some are considered to do evil because they worship other gods or they promote injustice. But we do have some kings who we are told did right what is in the eyes of the Lord. And among them, the author reserves high praise for those who also closed down the high places. These would have been local, possibly domestic altars, many of which would have been located on hilltops or mountains. Now, in Judah, they would have probably been devoted to the Lord, at least originally, but they could also become sites of syncretistic and idolatrous worship. For example, many archaeological discoveries in Israel at this period see examples of shrines where God, the Lord, was worshipped alongside Baal or Ashtoreth or other pagan gods. So for our author, the really good kings of Judah were the ones who did not allow this syncretistic worship to continue.